And Heather, you are welcome to get started when you're ready.
Great. Thank you so much, Nicole, for that great introduction. And I just want to thank everyone for the opportunity to be part of this call today. I'm really excited about this. And as Nicole mentioned, I have been working with the 4-H program for 21 years. But something you might not know is I got my start in horticulture. So I actually have a bachelor's and master's degree in horticulture. I had wanted to work at a botanical garden. That was my dream. And so my advisor for my master's program said, well, you really need to work with 4-H. You'll get great experience writing grants, working with volunteers. That'll set you up for success to get those botanical garden jobs, which are highly competitive. So that's what I did, and I got really invested in the 4-H program, and here I am 21 years later, and just wrapping up an interim term, almost for a year and a half, as the interim associate 4-H program leader for Florida. And that is really where I got some intense training in conflict management. So I'd like to share with you some of the strategies that we've used to address conflict in 4-H, because we really have to think about the fact that we both have extension volunteer programs. They might have different content, but the way we work through conflict with our volunteers is really going to be the same. So for our discussion today, we have 3 parts. The first is to really talk a little bit about conflict styles, and then sources of conflict. And this is where the questions that you sent me ahead of time came in really helpful. So we're going to talk about those and address those great questions that you sent in. And then I just wanted to share some tools that have really helped me develop my conflict skills. And it has been a journey for 21 years. And I've made a lot of mistakes, but I've learned a lot too along the way. So hopefully this will address a lot of your questions about conflict. So we're going to start with the conflict styles. It's really important when we're faced with conflict that we think a little bit about our conflict style. So a lot of times we either take flight or we get ready to fight. That's our natural tendency when we're faced with conflict. And a lot of it has to do with the way that we were raised, maybe the way that our parents handled conflict. And there's not necessarily a bad way or a good way, but there are different styles. So it's helpful to know what your own conflict style is. And then also knowing what other conflict styles are, that can help you be more intuitive when you're working with volunteers that might have a style that's different from yours. So there are lots of different assessments. One that I have used and I found really helpful is the Thomas Kilmann Conflict Assessment. And it has 5 different conflict styles that are based on 2 different dimensions. So one dimension is your assertiveness. That's the degree to which a person tries to satisfy their own concerns or their own initiatives. And then the other dimension has to be with how cooperative you are. So, and that has to do with how much you are willing to satisfy someone else's concerns. So there's 5 different ones. The competing one is the most assertive and the most uncooperative. So as we're talking through these, you might think of different individuals that you may work with that might fit one of these conflict styles, but don't put any names in the chat box. Just keep that to yourself. But these kind of people, they really want to satisfy their own concerns at their teammates' expense or at other people's expense. The collaborating is also assertive, but it is cooperative, so that's positive. These people try to find win-win solutions that completely satisfy their concerns as well as the concerns of others, and that's probably where a lot of us want to be. And then right in the middle, you have compromising. And compromising is where it's kind of equal assertiveness and cooperativeness. So that's not a bad place to be either. But you try to find an acceptable settlement that satisfies maybe only part of your desires, but also satisfies someone else's. Avoiding. I found myself in this category early on in my career. I was not comfortable dealing with conflict at all. And that's when you're unassertive and uncooperative. You try to avoid conflict at all costs. And that's not where we want to be. And so we have to work. If that's where you fall in the spectrum, definitely there are some things you can work on to get more towards that middle ground. Accommodating is when a person is unassertive and uncooperative, and they attempt to satisfy everyone else's concerns rather than at the expense of their own. And so that's not necessarily a good place you want to be either. So those are the 5 different conflict styles, and there's probably a department at your institution that can administer this assessment. I would have loved to have administered that today, but I don't own the rights to it. You have to pay for it. But it's not very expensive. And so at UF, our Department of Agriculture Communications, they have people there who are certified to facilitate and administer the test. And if you have access to someone like that, this would be a great exercise for you to do with your Master Gardener volunteers, especially those that are in leadership positions, or even your advisory committee, or if you have a foundation or a 501c3 foundation, this would be an excellent thing for you to do with your board members. So I highly recommend it, and it's good just to kind of know what these different styles are. I'm going to pause for a minute just to see if there are any questions related to conflict styles. I don't think there are. Okay. So the other thing we really want to talk about is getting into the sources of conflict, and this is where a lot of your questions came in. So once you know what your conflict style and you're familiar with the other conflict styles, you really want to think about when someone comes to you with a conflict, think about, well, what's the source? What's the source of this conflict coming from? And I took all of the questions and I found that they all fell within one of these 3 categories. Now, these are not the only sources of conflict, but in my experience with volunteers, these are the most common sources of conflict. So it's a good place to start. So the first road sign you see, there's conflict that arises due to a change in leadership, a change in your program, your policy, any type of conflict that's the result of some kind of change. The second kind has to do when volunteers have feelings of entitlement instead of empowerment. And this is a big one that I had to deal with almost immediately when I began my term as Interim Associate Program Leader. We had a lot of entitlement going on, and that's a tricky place to start from. And then finally, sometimes there can be conflict because volunteers don't feel appreciated or supported. And so those are the 3 main sources of conflict that we're gonna talk about today. So we're gonna start with change management. And you've probably heard, I know I have heard, that extension agents are change agents. And that is, but I found that extension, or at least in Florida, sometimes we don't manage change very well. And that is a shame. We need to get better at doing that. So I am not an expert in change management, but I am a scholar of change management. I am working on my doctoral degree, and part of my degree involves being certified in change management. And I had never heard of that before I went back to school. And I found out that change management really is about facilitating change in organizations. And I felt like that would be an amazing leadership skill for all of our extension agents to have, regardless if they're 4-H or horticulture or whatever program they work with. And there are 3 approaches to change management that I've been learning about. The first one is called the coercive approach. And this is the one that I've seen a lot in extension. And that's when people are told, just do it. So about 10 years ago, there was legislation passed in Florida that said all of our 4-H volunteers had to be screened through the Department of Children and Families, and that they would get to decide who could be a volunteer, not us. So that was a major change. And we were told, well, you just have to do it. It's the law. And so in those kinds of examples, the organization doesn't really provide a justification for the change. They just say you have to do it. And this approach can be good in an emergency situation, but that's really the only time it's appropriate. And obviously when there's a law passed, it's appropriate then too. But we've seen a lot of this recently with the COVID-19. So we've had stay-at-home orders where we've told you have to work remotely and you just have to figure out how to do your job from home. And there may or may not have been a lot of support from your organization to figure that out, but it was an emergency situation. So hopefully, if you have an opportunity to decide and control how that change is implemented when it's not an emergency or not a result of legislation, you might want to pick one of the other 2 approaches. So the second approach is a good one. It's a good middle ground. It's called the persuasive approach. And in this approach, people are told, well, you need to make this change because it's in your best interest. And so in this approach, leaders will provide some direction. They don't always provide clear information about the benefits or the measurable milestones and feedback along the way. So that's important if you go with this approach. You want to make sure, in order for it to be a good balanced approach, that you're providing clear messages about the benefits of the change and also feedback to your volunteers as the change is being implemented on what's working well and what we need to continue to work on. So then finally, the third approach to change is called the normative approach. And this one takes the most time, but it's the most effective long-term. And that's when you really involve your volunteers in driving the change. So maybe your volunteers have come to you with a problem and you set up a committee to work through that problem and to develop some best practices to implement the change and correct that. But that one can be really time consuming to involve the right people and to come to a consensus for that. But long term, it can be the most effective way to change the direction or the scope of your organization or your group. So that's my crash course on change management, but I have seen a lot of conflict over the years when we need to make changes to our programs, maybe to be more inclusive, or youth protection was a big one, and that has to do with safety. In Florida, we've also been dealing with changes as to how we handle funds that our volunteers raise. So that's another area of conflict that we've dealt with. And we don't always have control over that, but when we can, if we can be more persuasive or have the normative approach, it will go much more smoothly. I'm going to pause here to see if there's any questions before we move on to the next source of conflict. Oops. Okay. If I miss one, Nicole, just let me know. So this is the biggest source of conflict I've dealt with over the years, and that's entitlement versus empowerment. We had a lot of volunteers and parents too, who were not volunteers but felt really entitled when they didn't get their way. And we had to do something to change that culture. So I actually have an amazing Master Gardener statewide coordinator here in Florida, Wendy Wilbur. She and I work together to try to address this from the volunteer perspective. You know, how can we change these things? And I did get several questions related to these things like when Master Gardener's group thinks that they control all the money instead of the agent, questions like that. So it's kind of a control issue. So entitlement is the belief that one is inherently deserving of privileges or special treatment, whereas empowerment is the process of becoming stronger and more confident, especially in controlling one's life and one's rights. And so empowerment is a good thing. We want our volunteers to be empowered. And so, like I said before, Wendy and I met with legal counsel. We involved HR, and we also involved. We have a program called Master Naturalist here in Florida. I don't know if other states have that, but that's also a volunteer program. And so we met with them as well because we wanted to have a unified front on this entitlement issue. And so we quickly realized that our entitlement problem, really, we set ourselves up for failure in a lot of different ways. And one of those ways was the way that we communicate with volunteers. So that was one of the biggest obstacles that we needed to address right away. So in Florida, we have something called the Sunshine Public Records Law, and that's where our emails, all of our communications are subject to public records release. I don't know if other states have that or not, but Florida does. And we were seeing a trend where our volunteers were weaponizing that. And so that if the agent didn't do what they wanted, they would say, well, I'm going to do a public records request on you, and I'm going to pull out all of your private information and share it on social media. It got really ugly in a couple of situations. I could tell you some stories. And so that was part of the entitlement. So we looked at the way that we spoke about volunteers, and we realized that, you know, a lot of our volunteers felt like they had the same rights and privileges as employees, and they don't. Here in Florida, our state, not UF, but the state of Florida has a volunteer policy that says that volunteers can be released at any time without reason. And when a volunteer was released, they of course wanted to know why, and often would get very angry and upset and cause some problems. So we had to do a better job explaining that there's a difference between volunteering for an organization and being an employee. So we no longer use the word appoint. We approve our volunteers. We don't use role or job descriptions. That was a big thing when I first started. It was important to have those descriptions. We now call them service descriptions, and we actually have the volunteers sign them every year annually. And we go over their responsibilities as well as our responsibilities as an organization so that that's very clear. We used to have counseling sessions when volunteers' behavior needed to be corrected, and we don't call them that anymore. We call them, we're going to have a conversation so that they don't feel like they're having an annual appraisal or review. And then we no longer terminate or fire volunteers. We release them from service. So we had to learn this new taxonomy with our volunteers and the way we speak about them. And I still catch myself having to correct myself from time to time because it's very different from when I first started. But we are seeing improvement in this. Another big thing is the way, not only the words that we use, but the way that we communicate with our volunteers. I have colleagues that only like to send emails or only like to do newsletters or only do social media. And we've really tried to encourage them to communicate in multiple ways. And so really think about, how do you communicate with your volunteers, and are you providing multiple methods to reach them so that they're understanding what they need to do and what you need from them. And then of course, being really careful of those public records laws if you have those in your state. So, okay, I'm looking at some of the comments. So, oh yeah, Wendy's on. Hey, Wendy. She's incorporated the word volunteer in the title Master Gardener Volunteer. So that's another great change that we've made here in Florida. So communication's a big one.
Heather, this is Nicole. I wasn't really thinking about this until you were just speaking, but sometimes I see the sense of entitlement even when people are applying to the volunteer program. So I think folks automatically assume, I want to be a volunteer, you're going to pick me, and I'm entitled to this position. So one of the things I try to do is making sure, to recruit people that have shared values, a commitment to service, a good kind of volunteer ethic. Maybe you could speak to that now or later if recruitment is important as well as a good step.
That's an excellent point. And we worked with our legal counsel to develop 3 different letters. We have a letter of approval. We have a letter of, I don't want to say rejection. That's not the correct word. There's another word, but in 4-H, if they don't pass the background screening, they cannot volunteer, and we don't control that. Department of Children and Families does. We also do interviews, and so sometimes there might be other reasons besides the background check that we choose not to accept a person as a volunteer if we just feel like they're not a good fit for working with youth. And then we have the release letter as well. So that's a great point. Yeah, sometimes they think it's an automatic thing, and it's not. It is a privilege to be an extension volunteer. That's an excellent point. Okay, there was a question. In the past, my county, we had a volunteer board with titles of president, vice president, etc. We use this in my county, but I recently did away with this and moved to volunteer advisory group. Do we have volunteer boards in Florida? We do. That's a great question. So we had a state volunteer group for 4-H. I can't speak to Master Gardeners, but Wendy might could. And then every county has an advisory group, and then counties that have foundations have a foundation board. And many counties also have a county 4-H volunteer association is the word that I'm looking for that, but it's not standard. Not every county in Florida has that. But yes, so I am going to talk a little bit about that in a minute. Yeah, so there's a question about job descriptions. Yeah, so it is important to state that they are not employees, and this is where it gets really tricky because in Florida, our volunteers they can have workers' compensation as a volunteer if they're a registered screened volunteer. And so a lot of times that sends a mixed message. Well, I get workers' compensation. How come I don't have all the other employee rights? So that's been a really tricky thing to work through here in Florida. I don't know if that's the case in other states or not. But yes, we use the word service description in Florida. That's how we call it. We don't call them role or job descriptions. We call them service descriptions now, and they have to sign them every year. Great questions. Okay. So we'll move on. A second thing that we felt like we needed to do a better job of to do better with this entitlement issue is to really make sure our orientation is on point. And so we had an orientation checklist for several years in 4-H, and we decided to go back and revise it. And again, our orientation involves going over a service description. HR has now also included a volunteer agreement that talks about the volunteer policies and very clearly that the volunteers have to sign every year. So those two documents they do every year. We also encourage our counties to go over our office procedures. And so I know your master gardeners are in the office quite a bit, probably more so than our 4-H volunteers. And so knowing those standard office procedures, like for using the copier or even using the break room are important for our volunteers to know. And then another big thing that we added was conflict protocol. And so that was a big deal. When I first started, we had a conflict protocol for 4-H, and it was very helpful. But due to different transitions in leadership at the state and regional levels, that had kind of gotten forgotten. And so one of the first things I did was to work with our dean and our legal counsel to revitalize that conflict protocol so that all of our administrators from the county level all the way up to the dean level understood the proper way that we're going to handle our conflict. And so if you don't have something like that in your state, I recommend that. It's been really helpful in helping our faculty and our staff and our volunteers understand the right inroads to handling conflict depending on where it's coming from. And I'm happy to share that document. If you want to email me afterwards, I'll share that document with you so you can kind of see how we set that up. I do have a little graphic that I use often when I'm helping our agents learn about conflict. And so sometimes the conflict is between volunteers. And so we have a specific way, if it's one volunteer having a conflict with another volunteer, there's a specific way we handle that. Sometimes the conflict involves the agent or the volunteer is upset with the extension agent or the master gardener coordinator. In my case, it'd be the 4-H agent. And so that's handled a very specific way. And we used, I think California had a really good conflict protocol, and we kind of developed ours around there where they have to put it in writing and they have to submit it within so many days of the conflict in order for it to kind of go up the chain. So we have 5 different types of conflict that we have in 4-H. Sometimes the conflict is over a state program that one of our state specialists might do. We had a really ugly conflict with our tailgate cookery contest that our meat specialist at the animal science department was putting on. And so we had to handle that a specific way. So I highly recommend, if you don't have a conflict protocol, to develop one, and then also make sure that's part of your orientation and your onboarding process with your volunteers. The third thing, and this talks a little bit more to the officers on your leadership or on your committees, is that we needed to have a rotation. This really was something that we had done a good job at the county level, but at the state level, we had a foundation board with members that had been there a really long time who didn't really understand what their role was and weren't doing what we needed them to do. I'm sure none of you have ever had this problem ever, right? So we implemented some term limits, and we decided that every 3 years we wanted some fresh leadership on our board. And so we set up a rotation, and there's a couple different ways you can do that. We had some members who were ready. They really didn't like the new direction we were headed in, and so they resigned on their own, and that was okay. We had some that we asked them to just draw a straw. You know, you're going to get a number 1, 2, or 3, and that's going to be how many more years you get to serve on the board. And so we did it that way. And then we brought in, as people left, we brought in people that we oriented much, and we made sure they were oriented and aligned with our vision for what our 4-H state foundation needed to be. And so this process takes 3 to 5 years. It's not an overnight thing. It's not an easy change, but it is important. And I can already see a huge difference. And our foundation is raising a lot more money for us now. But it's been about 2 years into this process, and we're not totally there yet. And so we had to have some uncomfortable conversations with some of our members, but on the whole, it's going really positive. So that's probably one of the hardest things that you have to do, or it was one of the hardest things for me, but it was definitely worth it. So I'm going to check the chat. I see some chat going on. Okay. Oh, the acronyms on the other slide. So on the other slide, APL stands for Associate Program Leader. That was me. The CED stands for County Extension Director. And then we have DEDs who are District Extension Directors. So it just stood for different positions that we had. And in the document, that's all explained, the acronyms. That was just a visual. How can coordinators handle volunteer approval screening in rural areas that typically see smaller class sizes? Yes. That can be really hard. I have a lot of rural counties in my district, and they have trouble recruiting volunteers, and it takes quite a bit of time because their population just isn't as large, and a lot of them commute to larger cities outside of the county, so they're not there during the week. So that can be really tough. We don't have quotas, though, in our state for how many new volunteers you have to recruit in a year, but we do encourage it. I don't know if that answered your question.
I'm not sure if this is possible, Chase, but perhaps there's a way to link the new training with advanced training for the veteran Master Gardeners that could help with retention and give you a fuller class size, and also keeping some of the previous volunteers engaged, if that's possible.
That's a great suggestion. We've talked about having a Master 4-H volunteer class in Florida. We haven't done it yet, but that would be another way to engage them and retain them. Very good. Okay. And Nicole, I will email that document to you when we're done. So those are the first two sources of conflict that I've seen quite a bit with our volunteers. The last one has to do with volunteer satisfaction. And so we had several questions related to this topic where either the culture in your office was not conducive to volunteering, or volunteers just didn't feel appreciated or supported. And those can be really hard things. And I relate them to volunteer satisfaction because one of my colleagues who's no longer at UF has published extensively on the relationship between volunteer satisfaction and volunteer motivation. And he's found a very strong correlation between the two. You can find his articles on Journal of Extension. I found them really interested. But basically his study, and he did multiple studies, found that, and he looked at all volunteers, not just 4-H. When volunteers are satisfied with their work as a volunteer and the organization that they volunteer for, they're much more motivated to do their job well and to work more hours. So a couple of different, I also read another study that said replacing one seasoned volunteer, I think this study was from Iowa, could cost an organization up to $12,000. Because if you think about it, especially if they have to be screened and then oriented and trained and all the experience, all of that, it can cost quite a bit of money to replace them, and money and time. Time is money, right? So retaining good volunteers is really important to the work that we do here in Extension. And like I said, the first has to do with your local office culture. And one of you asked specifically about this. Not all Extension programs utilize volunteers. It makes sense to us because that's our world that we live in. But my ag agents, they don't utilize volunteers too much. They might work with their cattleman board and they volunteer a little bit. But on the whole, they're working with specialists and other agents. They're not working with volunteers. So they may not get it, and they may not understand the volunteer culture. And so we have to orient them to that and prepare them. And so Susan Ellis is a volunteer. She's a speaker and publisher on volunteer management. You probably heard of her. She wrote a really wonderful book about preparing your office and your organization for volunteers and helping to build a positive volunteer culture. So I think Nicole shared the slides with you, but it is linked in the slide, a link to her book. It's a great read, and she has several activities and worksheets that would be helpful for you to do maybe during a staff meeting to help your office develop a philosophy of volunteering, and also to help your peers understand what they can do to support and encourage volunteering in your office. I see lots of things in the chat, so I'm going to check that. Okay. How do you deal with volunteers getting involved in office politics that really should not concern them? That is a great question. So that I feel like should be more of the extension director. If you have a county extension director, something that they should probably address with that volunteer and let them know that, you know, this is really a university issue or a county commissioner issue, whatever that issue is politically. We have a policy, part of our volunteer policy addresses, you know, you can't go lobby for a certain political figure as a volunteer. You can do it as a private citizen, but you can't do that on behalf of the extension program. So I don't know if that's what you were talking about or not. So the title of the book, I believe, is Leading a 21st Century Volunteer Program. And it has a lot of information about volunteers, but the first 2 chapters deal specifically with how to develop a pro-volunteer culture at your office. So that's the part of the book that I would really focus on. And like I said, when you get the slides, you can link it, and I'll also make sure I send the title with the link to Nicole in her follow-up email so that you'll have that. So preparing your organization is really important. A lot of us think, well, you know, I know 4-H has been around over 100 years. I'm not sure how long Master Gardeners has been around. You would think all of our coworkers would get it by now, but not necessarily. And so we have a responsibility to help them with that. Another thing that can really help address your volunteer satisfaction and motivation is to think about a year-round recognition. So I know I have been guilty in the past of thinking of volunteer recognition as sort of a one-time thing. Maybe I just send a thank you note after a big event, or I have a volunteer appreciation luncheon, and that's kind of it. But the research has shown that it's better to incorporate it year-round. And so in the slide, I've linked a great Journal of Extension article written by a couple of, I forget exactly who, Ken Culp is one of the authors. But it gives you several sample calendars for year-round recognition. And so before you panic and think, I don't have the time or the money to do that, it's important to know that it does not have to be expensive or time consuming. It just takes a little planning and thought ahead of time. And so this article gives some very specific things that you can do that are pretty simple. We've started to do this in several counties in my district, and it's making a very positive difference. And just keep in mind, there are 3 types of volunteer motivation that are linked to recognition. So they're achievement, affiliation, and power. So some volunteers do seek achievement, and that would be things like recognizing them at a banquet or giving them a plaque or having their picture in the newspaper. Those are all achievement motivation type things. Unfortunately, that's not what most volunteers want, according to the research. And that typically is what most extension programs focus on. And we need to change our practice for that. It's great to have those kinds of events, but that's not really what motivates volunteers and makes them feel appreciated. Some volunteers are motivated by power, and that would be serving on a board or a committee or a foundation. Those are power affiliation type things. Most volunteers do not seek that. However, the ones that do make great advisory committee members or foundation board members, so use them in that way. Research finds that most volunteers, they're motivated by affiliation. And so that's going to be affiliation with the Master Gardener program or affiliation with the university in your state that you work for that supervises the Master Gardener program. That's what they are seeking. And so, in fact, when my grandfather passed away, his obituary included that he was a master gardener. He was very proud of being a master gardener. Even though he was an Alabama fan and the Master Gardener program in Alabama is run through Auburn, he was still very proud to be a Master Gardener, and he had a strong affiliation with the Master Gardener program. So a few years ago, our state initiated a volunteer recognition campaign on social media during the month of April, which is National Volunteer Recognition Month. And I'm currently conducting a research study on that to find out if it really satisfies our volunteers' need for recognition. And we added a little something extra in my district. This month, during the month of April, we had videos every day that were highlighting the contributions and impacts of our volunteers. And we recognized over 50 volunteers in 30 days. So it's pretty intense, but we had amazing response to that. And so I'm in the process now of interviewing some of our volunteers to find out whether or not that really met their needs for recognition or if we need to do something different. So I'm going to check the chat box again. So I saw it moving, flashing. Okay. Yes, a pro volunteer office is very important for that volunteer morale. So I highly recommend that book if that is an area that you're struggling with in there. And so if you get the PowerPoint, I've linked one of our videos that we created in there that you can watch and kind of see what we did. It was super simple. We used Adobe Spark to create these videos and it took like 10 minutes. So might be something you want to do. And if you, oh, sorry, it began to play. All right, I'm not sure what happened here, but our third and final part of the presentation is to talk a little bit about some of my favorite resources for really building your conflict toolbox. And so I have 3 resources that are online that are not affiliated with Extension at all, but I really like them and I've learned a lot from them. There is a site called Volunteer Pro. It's a volunteer administration website. Toby Johnson is kind of the CEO and she offers a paid subscription. I've never paid to be part of her subscription, but I do subscribe to her blog. She has some great articles that I have found really helpful. She has free webinars. She also has some that charge a fee, but I just go to the free ones. And she has a community of practice on Facebook. And so it's a Facebook group that I've joined and gotten some really great ideas from other volunteer administrators. So this is really any organization that works for volunteers, not necessarily Extension. But I have found sometimes it's really helpful to go outside of Extension to learn what other organizations are doing so that I can keep track on trends and changes in the volunteer world and also expand my toolbox there. There's an online journal called eVolunteerism that I subscribe to. It's really inexpensive to subscribe to, and there are Extension professionals, both Master Gardener and 4-H, that contribute publications to this article, and they have some great resources. They also have a really good bookstore. So a lot of the books Susan Ellis has written are available through their bookstore online. And then more recently, I've begun to work with or subscribe to the Volunteer Match Learning Center. It is free. And so Volunteer Match, some of you may have even advertised your Master Gardener programs on Volunteer Match. It's an online volunteer matching service where you can post different volunteer opportunities. And they have a free and a paid version. Again, I just use the free version. But they have a whole series of webinars, and there are beginner, advanced, and intermediate, and some of them are really, really good. They had one recently on how to use social media to train your volunteers that I found really helpful. That's an interest that I have in using social media for education, informal education. So I suggest that you check that out and sign up for some webinars that might interest you. They do have a series on conflict. I haven't taken it yet, but you might want to check that out as well. So those are some online resources that are mainly free. And there are some books that I recommend. The first 2 on the screen, the ones that are white and orange, those deal with managing change. So if the sources of your conflict in your county or your state have to do with implementing change, I love these 2 books for that. These were required readings for my classes on change management. My favorite is the middle one, Leading Change by John P. Cotter. And he actually has an 8-step process for managing change in your organization that I have found to be very effective. So if you're only going to order one book, that would be one. The red and orange one called Standing in the Fire is excellent if you are just looking for ways to learn more about conflict. So this book was recommended to me a couple of years ago when I took the Lead IFAS program. That is a program, it's a leadership program for administrators in IFAS, which is Extension here in Florida. And it's a really good read. All of these are available as ebooks, as paper books, or even as audiobooks, and they're pretty inexpensive. So you might want to invest in those. I'm going to check the chat again. My favorite resource, and some of you may have heard of this, is the National Extension Conference on Volunteerism. Wendy and I go to that pretty regularly. It's only every other year, and this conference is for any Extension volunteer program. So I love it that there are, there's Family Consumer Science, there's Master Gardener, there's 4-H. We all come together to learn from each other. In the past, I've done sessions on volunteer recognition. The last time I had a session on dealing with volunteer conflict, where we actually administered the conflict style assessment. And Wendy, I know, has presented, and many of you may have too. I am planning on presenting my research on social media recognition at this coming conference. The call for proposals has not gone out yet. So if you're interested, this is really my favorite Extension conference. I love it more than my own professional association because it's so rich, and I just learn so much about managing volunteers every time I go. So you can follow their Facebook group, or there is a link on this post that you can click on to get more information about the conference. But it will be in Oklahoma this in 2021, and hopefully all the travel bans will be lifted and we'll be able to participate in that. So, okay. I am not sure what's happening with the PowerPoint, but that is really what I had prepared for today. Oops, sorry, it wants to play. I'm going to stop the share here and go to, so we talked about, in summary, we talked about conflict styles. We talked about 3 sources of conflict and a few strategies to help mitigate that. And then also I shared with you a few of my favorite resources for managing conflict and learning how to be a better manager of conflict personally, for your personal professional growth. Let's see, I'm not seeing any questions in the chat box. So at this time, I don't know how we're doing on time. It's 1:51, but I'll hang on if there's any questions.
We're great on time if anyone wants to ask questions or put some comments or notes in the chat box. I did want to say, Heather, I think your idea of rotating people through leadership positions and having term limits can indirectly address a lot of conflict. So a couple of the things that came through that people needed some help with was when you have, volunteers who have a strong sense of ownership over a project, but what happens if something happens to that person or they step down? So having some kind of a term limit or, other folks that can take up those roles would be very helpful. It also helps with maybe the new Master Gardeners and the veteran Master Gardeners, and that they can meet each other, hear different ideas, and then you don't have sort of that old guard versus the new guard. And one of the suggestions that I have is, in my county, we started doing project fairs. We used to call them job fairs, but now they're project fairs. And we bring in the veteran Master Gardeners to talk about all of the different projects with the new folks. So it's a really great opportunity for camaraderie. I'm not the one that's up there speaking. They're teaching each other and asking each other questions. But then also, if somebody has an idea for how to improve a process or do things differently, they seem a little more amenable because they've met each other, they've talked to each other, and they've shared ideas. And so those were some indirect benefits of having the project fair when we teach the class. So does anyone have any other questions? I do see some coming in on the chat box. And if you need to leave, you're more than welcome. We're recording this still, but if you want to stay on as we answer these questions, you're welcome to do that too.
I had a question. I was wondering, when you're running a group of formal volunteers or running a Master Gardener general meeting, do you find that having an agenda and a set topic and a plan helps with heated meetings and that such thing, where we kind of derail and go off topic and then people get angry and upset? making things flow better, because I'm trying that. I have a meeting next week. I put a whole PowerPoint together, hoping that it's a calmer, more relaxing meeting because of that. But I was just wondering if anybody noticed a difference between doing meetings kind of off the cuff versus a more planned, structured meeting.
I found it really helpful to have a little more structure. So if it's a small thing, I would confront that person individually. If it's clearly like one person that's the source of the conflict, I would not confront them in front of everyone. That would be terrible. But confront them privately, and that could be more off the cuff. But if it's more of an organizational thing where there's a lot of conflict from the board, having an agenda and also laying down some ground rules for the meeting before you start to let them know, these are the things we're going to discuss. And often I'll use those sticky big sheets of paper, and we'll have a parking lot. So if someone brings something up that they want to discuss that's off topic, we'll put it on the parking lot. And if we have time at the end of the meeting, we'll talk about it, or it'll be tabled until the next meeting. And so I found that to be a pretty effective way to deal with that.
Rebecca, I'm just going to share personal experience. I'm a huge fan of agendas, mostly because just for me individually, I'm the type of person that likes to prepare and get my thoughts together before I show up to a meeting. So if I show up to a meeting and there's no agenda, or I don't have that little bit of time to get my thoughts together, I'm not saying it makes me more defensive, but it takes me back a step, and I really appreciate knowing kind of what I'm getting into. And then it's mostly coming from a place of where I feel I can contribute the most and be helpful. So I agree with you. I think that really helps. And then my suggestion is that if it ends up taking more time than it is allotted, schedule another meeting, but also task people to come up with solutions and bring those back to the meeting. So it might reduce some bickering, but it also makes everybody part of the decision-making process. And then as a group, you can come to consensus, and maybe they could help you out a little bit more. Not everything has to be tackled in one meeting. I have friends who are managers, and they have 3-hour staff meetings. I'm like, that is crazy to me, but I think that that's a really great approach that you're coming up with.
Yeah, and someone else also commented that sometimes having a facilitator to talk about that is an excellent strategy when it's really heated discussion. And so they can be a little more objective to make sure that everyone is heard and has a turn to voice their opinion. And a lot of times that passion does come from being invested in the program, and we have to remind that. I mean, some people are just difficult, but the majority of our volunteers there's conflict because they're super passionate about what they're involved in, and they care a lot. Yeah, and it is very, very important to refer back to those policies, and that can help alleviate a lot of the pressure there. Someone asked a question about being a new staff person or faculty member working with really veteran volunteers. I've seen this a lot. In my county, we've had a lot of turnover with our horticulture agent. And usually they're young and fresh out of school, and then they might be working with master gardeners or 4-H volunteers who have been here 20, 30 years even. And so that can be really hard because the volunteers feel like they have to train the new agent. And so I think establishing a rapport with your master gardener, saying that, it's a two-way street, you want to learn from them and they need to learn from you, can be a great way to approach that. And that you're going to be learning some things you're going to learn together through experience as things change and evolve. But that can be really tricky. And hopefully your supervisor is going to support your decisions. And so anytime as a new agent, when I had to make a big change or implement a new policy, I would have a discussion with my supervisor to make sure that we were both on the same page, and also to talk about potential ways to handle conflict that might arise from that. And that was a very effective way to deal with that, because coming in, they don't really see you necessarily as an authority figure because they have more experience than you do with the program. So that was a great question.
We also have a question that asks, when you have seasoned volunteers who feel entitled, how do you change their thought process? So if anyone has suggestions on how you've handled this, feel free to share. Sometimes for me, going back to my advisory committee, some of my advisory committee members are volunteers, but my advisory committee has been helpful to me making recommendations programmatically, and so I've been able to fall back on them sometimes.
Yeah, you can use them effectively to help support decisions that you've made or policies you might have had to change. I did see a suggestion, don't rush to make change. That is really important. I usually tell my new agents, I said, for the first year, you're really observing and taking notes, looking at what works well and what might need to work better, and just really focus on establishing that relationship before you come in and make a bunch of changes, unless it's a safety issue. So for us, anything related to youth protection that's not being done the way it needs to be done would have to be addressed immediately. But the other things we can take our time with. Oh, so someone asked about brainstorming opportunities or projects for volunteers to be part of. I haven't had that problem in 4-H. Sometimes it takes a while to find the right fit for a volunteer. I don't know about Master Gardeners. You can always encourage them to work with youth. I know your 4-H agent would be really happy if they wanted to help with a school garden or something like that.
I think when I first started as a Master Gardener volunteer coordinator, I really relied on a lot of the veteran Master Gardeners to help me get started, and they had been in their roles for quite some time, and I greatly appreciated that. I think as the years have gone by, when I'm teaching the new class, I'm just indirectly teaching folks multiple skills, and so that they can take leadership positions in different areas. So if someone does soil testing and gets bored with that, they can be a speaker or they can help at the help desk. And indirectly, I think what we're finding, at least in my county, is when someone can do a few different jobs, they have a better peer network because they have more Master Gardener friends. They feel very invested in the organization, but they're not just doing one thing. That would really be detrimental if they left. And I'm hoping it will help with satisfaction. So over the years, I've really tried to just expose volunteers to multiple opportunities within our volunteer program. And I think that's helping over time. And I want to mention, someone has sent me a message too, that don't be afraid to make difficult decisions. Sometimes that's necessary, and that's an excellent point.
Yeah, and I just added in the chat, if you have someone that you're rotating off of a leadership position who has good experience, often we will look at them and ask them to serve as a middle manager. So they might be a volunteer recruiter to help us recruit new volunteers in areas of the county where we don't have a 4-H program, or I'll involve them in training volunteers or orienting volunteers. That's a great way to use their expertise and their experience and still keep them engaged, even though they might not be on the board.
That's a great point, Heather. In Florida with Master Gardeners, Wendy does a great job of having the leadership school, so we can send a few stellar volunteers to the leadership school to learn like non-horticulture skills and add to their leadership repertoire. So those are great opportunities too to maybe think outside the box and, you know, non-horticulture training and opportunities. All right, are there any other comments or questions for Heather about volunteer conflicts? Of course, we'll send out the links to the documents, and Heather, I appreciate you mentioning the conflict protocol, because it may sound silly, but I had a volunteer who was very upset because she couldn't get help at the copier machine, and someone just thought it was not that person's job. And I had to, you know, run interference over a copy. And almost lose somebody that, you know, we had worked with for so long. So I am looking forward to reading the office protocol that you've come up with. So, thank you. All right, so I don't see very many other questions, just a lot of comments coming in, learned a lot. Thank you for the topic. I do appreciate everyone being on the call today. I hope that you had some tips from Heather that you can try. I love to read, so I'm going to take you up on some of those book recommendations. And then we will be sending out information for our next webinar. We have these the third Wednesday of every month at 2 p.m. And then as soon as I post the recording, I'll send the link to the recording out along with the references that Heather's mentioned in her presentation. And of course, if you have any other questions, you may email Heather or get in touch with me to forward to Heather. I'm happy to do that. And we appreciate you all being on the call. I hope you have a great rest of the week. Hope you're all still doing well amid COVID. And just take care and have a good week and a great weekend and try to rest.
Nicole?
Yes.
I put my email address in here. We got this forwarded from our state coordinator at Rutgers University. I'm not on your mailing list. Can you add?
I can send you instructions, Rebecca. So the mailing list is through Extension. So you would go into Extension, and it's a community of practice for Master Gardener coordinators, and then you'll get all of the announcements from anything that's, you know, Master Gardener volunteer related. So it's a real quick 2-step process, and I'll send you a link to that.
Okay, thank you.
You're very welcome. Also, if you could forward that to your colleagues in case they also aren't on the mailing list, then please send that to them so they can join too.
Okay, thank you. Sure, we got it, but thank you. Thanks for sending it.
I appreciate that your coordinator sent that to you all. All right, well, great job, Heather. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. We had such a good group on today and learned a lot from one another.
Thank you. I enjoyed this very much.
Yeah.
And I hope to see some of you at the Extension Conference on Volunteerism.
Yes, hope to be there. I'm looking forward to being able to travel again. All right, everyone, take care. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.